Good evening, everyone. Certainly a blessing to see all of you here this evening. It's always encouraging to see the number that come out when they know that there might be an amateur preacher coming up here to speak. So very encouraged to see all of you here this evening. The lesson I'm going to be preparing and bringing before you this evening is one about character. And we're going to particularly focus on one individual that I think exemplifies the type of character that I need and that I think you might need as well. So character is one of those semi-abstract concepts. Whether we know it or not, we all possess it. Our character isn't necessarily something tangible, and for the younger people in the audience, tangible meaning something you can touch. It's something that can be seen but not be seen. Webster does a pretty good job defining the term as the aggregate of features and traits that form the individual nature of some person or thing, moral or ethical quality, reputation. And I think reputation probably captures something that's more common to us, something that we can kind of attach to and understand a little better. It would be the innermost thoughts, feelings, desires manifested of our spiritual man and reflected to the outside world. Character can be a good thing or a bad thing. We can be known by it within the confines of what we do within our lives. And so this evening we're going to focus on an example of what I would consider to be good character. So there are many individuals within the pages of both the Old Testament and the New Testament that we could use to go to and focus on, to emulate because of their character. For instance, when we think of the patriarchs, we likely think of Abraham as a man of faith, Isaac as the son of promise, perhaps Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, all of which we would describe to them to be very righteous, very godly, God-fearing men. Yet consider this about the patriarch Joseph, whom we're going to be speaking about this evening. More space in Genesis is devoted to him than to the others. He encompassed 14 chapters, and so we're going to go through that pretty lickety-split tonight, those 14 chapters. So it won't do it service, so I encourage you to go and read those 14 chapters, but we're going to go through this pretty quickly. Furthermore, there is not a single word of reproof against Joseph. Indeed, the character of Joseph is something that I think would be worth our time and study. His nobility of character, his purity of heart and life, his generosity and forgiveness, both as a ruler and as a brother. All of these contribute to make him an illustration of someone we should emulate for the character that they displayed in their lives, from youth through middle life, and ultimately in the culmination of his death. So we're going to take a brief review of that life of Joseph tonight to be reminded of the wonderful character that he displays. We begin with Joseph as a son in Canaan. So if you would, open your Bibles, and we're going to be looking in Genesis, and we're going to start in Genesis chapter 37. We're going to go through all the way through 50, but we're not going to read every single passage. So, Genesis chapter 37, and let's read the first 4 verses. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding a flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So as we see Joseph beginning in here, he's hated by his brothers. We can see that in verse 2, telling on his brothers didn't appear to help too much. Favoritism by his father in verses 3 and 4 probably hurt that as well. We see in verses 5 through 11, as Joseph begins recounting his dreams to his brothers, that made it a little bit worse, because his brothers are recognizing that Joseph is having dreams where they're going to be somewhat subservient to Joseph. They're going to be bowing down to Joseph. as displayed in these dreams. And so this does not engender a lot of well-being between his brothers towards Joseph. And we see the culmination of that in their decision to sell him into bondage. Originally, they were planning to kill him, but we see that he was interceded by one of his brothers. So in verses 12 through 36 is where we find that. And Reuben, in verses 21 and 22, is the one who had initially set him aside, who wanted to keep him alive and had initially intended to free him. We see that he was ultimately spared by death by Judah, who suggested slavery by a company of Ishmaelite traders instead in verses 26 and 27. So we see kind of a rocky relationship here within his family, seen in his early life. Besides this, though, we do see some examples that we can follow, particularly in the faithfulness to his father. We see some children rebel against their parents, and I think we can see that kind of in the brothers, Reuben and Judah and the others. They did not live a life initially here where that you would seek to see that as an example. They were hateful to Joseph. They were hateful to others. They were leading lives that we would not find as an example. But Joseph remained faithful to his father. If you look in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 13, we see that despite all these many things and all this hatred that is shown him, in verse 13 it says, "And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, here I am." We see that phrase, "here I am," many other times throughout the Bible, and essentially that phrase is a call to service. I'm here, I'm ready to do what you need me to do. We see that in multiple individuals throughout the scriptures. So we see in Joseph here, in spite of the great love his father has for him, that he's been betrayed by his brothers in the chapter of verse 37. And one might think that such ill treatment, followed by separation from both country and kin, would produce a measure of bitterness, a measure of hopelessness in such a young man. Remember, at this point in time, Joseph is just 17 years old. He's a young man. He's still finding himself, so to speak. And so the fact that he has such a strong character to live above this, I think, is something that we should take to heart. And we see that continue to shine and continue to evolve as we see Joseph as a slave in Egypt. Initially, he is an overseer in Potiphar's house. So we pick up the rest of our story here in Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39, and let's read the first 6 verses there. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand. He did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Though a young man, we see that Joseph proves himself both industrious and trustworthy. So much so that Potiphar made him overseer of everything. He didn't even give thought to what he had anymore, just that there was food when he needed it. Everything was provided for him. Everything was taken care of. We see Joseph making the best of a bad situation. We see that God is continuing to bless him, not only him, but Potiphar as well. We see, as we picked up there in the latter part of verse 6, that he was a handsome man in appearance. Because of this, Joseph was tempted by Potiphar's wife. In Genesis 39, in verses 6 through 20, we kind of see the accounting of that. She tries time and time again to seduce him, and yet despite all this, he resists her out of faithfulness to both Potiphar and to God in verses 8 and 9. With her advance of spurn, she spitefully accuses him wrongfully, and this results in angering Potiphar and ultimately results in Joseph's imprisonment. Despite all this, Joseph remains steadfast in his obedience and his love of God. As an overseer in Pharaoh's prison, we continue on. Look in chapter 39 again, picking up in verses 21 through 23. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So again, we see a very similar situation befalling Joseph. He's back into prison, but he has someone who trusts in him because he trusts in God. He's placed in charge of other prisoners. He is given complete and utter control. And he continues to prosper in his role by God who is with him. As we continue along here, we pick up in chapter 40, verses 1 all the way through chapter 41 and verse 36. We see this recounting here of Joseph being an interpreter of dreams. We see that he's initially forgotten and then remembered as we go along here. But initially, he interprets the dreams of both the butler and the baker. Look at Genesis chapter 40 and verse 8. We have multiple dreams going on here, but I want you to see who Joseph gives the credit to. It's picking up here in verse 8. Butler and the baker both speaking, and they said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." So Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." So Joseph again is recognizing God in his situation, in his plight. He knows that God's there. He knows that he's with him. And he knows that God can facilitate whatever he might need in these situations. The butler's dream, we see 3 branches bearing grapes, where the butler squeezes those into Pharaoh's cup and then places the cup in Pharaoh's hand. We also see the baker's dream, 3 baskets of baked goods and birds eating from the top basket. The dreams come to fruition. The butler does in fact return to his former glory in Pharaoh's court and serves him once again. The baker, however, does not. He is hung, and the birds feast from him. Joseph, however, was forgotten. Genesis chapter 40, verses 20 through 23. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he was made a feast for his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Yet again, Joseph encounters some hardship. Despite all of the magnificent things that God has continually done for him, he still finds himself in some somewhat difficult situations, frustrating situations, situations that shouldn't be. It's not fair. Situations that we can probably think to somewhat akin in our own lives. It's not fair. But Joseph maintained his acknowledgement of God, his faith in God. And for 2 years, he maintains that until Pharaoh has a dream and needs an interpretation. Pharaoh dreams about 7 fat cows coming out of the river and then being devoured by 7 gaunt cows, and 7 plump heads of grain being devoured by 7 thin heads. No one can interpret these dreams save Joseph through God. Joseph again acknowledges God in these interpretations, and he does so multiple times. Look, if you would, in Genesis chapter 41, and let's begin in verse 16. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." And again, in verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do." And in verse 28, "This is the thing which I've spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." And finally, again, in verse 32, "And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass." Joseph could have taken credit for this, but he didn't. He chose not to. He chose to give credit where credit was due. That belonged in the hands of God, who had continually seen to Joseph throughout all these many hardships. Joseph knew that. He gave God the credit for it, and his faith was strengthened because of it. What Joseph did continue to do, though, is he offered advice in regards to those dreams, and we see that in Genesis 41, verses 33 through 36. So as we go along here, we see as a slave in Egypt, he is falsely accused, he is forgotten by man, and many wonder why bother to be righteous. Joseph maintained his integrity, his patience, his humbleness, and that he was not forgotten by God. He found favor in the eyes of Potiphar, just as he found favor in the eyes of Pharaoh. Because of this, he was exalted again. At the age of 30, Joseph is exalted to rule over Egypt. Look in chapter 41, verses 38 through 46. "And Pharaoh said to his servants, 'Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you.' And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt.' Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had made him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, 'Bow the knee.' So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, 'I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt.' And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt." That's quite the turnaround there, from being in the prison for years to being recognized as literally the most powerful man in Egypt, save only for Pharaoh. It's quite the exaltation. His wisdom is manifested in his administration over Egypt during this time period. He showed great foresight during the years of plenty, and we can see that reflected in chapter 41, verses 47 through 49. We also see his shrewdness during the years of famine in verses 53 through 57, and also in chapter 47, verses 13 through 26. Throughout all of this, he maintains his understanding and his knowledge, his faith in God, that these are God's blessings. They came from God. We see also during his time as a prince of Egypt that Joseph was merciful in his treatment of his brethren. Look also, if you would, at chapter 41 again, and we're going to be reading verses 57 into chapter 42. So by the time the famine came around, it's affecting Egypt pretty significantly. But it's not just Egypt that's being affected. We see in verse 57, "So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." We see in the 42nd chapter, they do so. They go down to Egypt. And we see somewhat of a reunion between Joseph and his brothers and his father, continuing all the way up into chapter 45. We see that he arranges for them to live in Goshen in Genesis chapter 46 and chapter 47. We see that he reassures his brothers that he has forgiven them. So Joseph could have dealt pretty shrewdly with his brothers, pretty harshly with his brothers at this time as well. They're coming to him at this point. They're coming essentially begging at this point for food to live. Joseph could have reigned over them. He could have held all those things within his heart and displayed them fully and openly, but he chose a different path. Look at chapter 45 and verses 1 through 8. Despite the harshness with which his brothers dealt with him, beginning in verse 45, or chapter 45 and verse 1. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. Imagine at this point in time, they're having a little bit of a gut check moment to realize that my brother is not only alive, he literally holds my life in his hands. Beginning in verse 4, and Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Joseph is sensing their hesitancy, their sense of fear. And he said to them, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." That's a pretty powerful way to view the world. All the circumstances that you find yourself in manifested as a plan that God had for you. He really turned around all those things that we would internalize for ourselves and be, "Woe is me, how pitiful I am, why can't things go my way?" And he looked at it from a standpoint that whatever happened to me turned around for good. It was something that happened, maybe not for my immediate benefit, but for the benefit of many, many others. Joseph saw a much bigger picture than you or I usually see. And it's one that I would encourage us to think about in our own lives. Myself included, I need to be able to see a much bigger picture. I need to be able to think about those things as God might see them. So he reveals himself first there, but he also reveals himself again in that heart that he has when Jacob died. Because again, his brothers are probably thinking at that time, there's nothing to restrain Joseph at this point. Jacob has died, Israel has died. There's whatever had maybe kept him thinking that, maybe he won't do it if Jacob's alive. There's nothing there stopping him now. And he reassures them yet again. So it's not something that they had thought. It's something that's inherent within Joseph. Joseph believed in the providence of God. Look, if you would, to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50, and we're going to look at verses 19 through 25. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation, the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, "I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." Again, Joseph had such an amazing outlook on life, such a much bigger perspective than we do sometimes. And just as John spoke to us this morning in Hebrews 11 concerning Joseph and his faithfulness, it lasted to the very end, with the recognition that God would keep his promises that he made to his people. So there's a lot of lessons that we could pull out of the character of Joseph here. As I stated earlier, our character is essentially the whole of our spiritual man. It's reflected to the outside world. We are known to others by our character, just as we know others by their character. It is something that can precede you so that others who may not have even met you may know of your character. It is not something you're born with. It cannot be bought or bartered. And above all, it cannot be hidden. A good character is something that is carefully sculpted over a lifetime of diligent, purposeful actions. On the other hand, it can be something that is tarnished with carelessness, with stubbornness, or even willful ignorance. And so we must ask ourselves, what manner of person are we? Is my character that which is pleasing to God? Turn, if you would, to the 15th Psalm. John's been going through the Psalms for some years now, and there's many wonderful things that we can find within the Psalms. David, a man after God's own heart, we see it exemplified in many of the Psalms. And I think in Psalm 15 here is something that we should all take to heart. Psalm of David, Psalm 15. "Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. In whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. He who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved." And I think that's where we need to be. We need to be in a place where we cannot be moved. Another question we might ask ourselves is, do I potentially have multiple characters? One for different situations or different friend groups or colleagues. Look, if you would, at Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, in verses 43 through 45. I think Jesus pretty conclusively tells us if we can have two characters in these verses. Beginning in verse 43, Jesus says, "For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say?" Contrasting works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit, we can see another example of the same thing in Galatians 5 and verses 19 and 23. The fact of the matter is, you cannot have two characters. Look at Galatians 5. Galatians 5 and verses 24 and 25. So as he's finishing up there, he talks about, beginning in 19, the works of the flesh, how they are evident, they're manifested. And then he talks about the fruits of the Spirit and what those are. But in verses 24 and 25, he summarizes this here, and he says, "And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit." We have to follow through with that life. It's what's within us. It needs to be exemplified outside of us as well. Another question we might ask ourselves is, if I feel threatened or rebuked by others or oppressed by others, do I assassinate another person's character? Look, if you would, again, back in Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. And let's look at verses 27 through 31. Jesus again here is saying, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise." We need to live like Joseph lived. We need to have a character like Joseph. Jesus tells us these things. He tells us to rise above these things, as we just read here. And we need to stretch ourselves, as it would be, so to speak, especially in light of circumstances that he presents in verses 32 through 34, where he talks about this is not just something that you do with people you like. It's not something you just do with those who you tend to hang around with, that you aggregate with. This is for everyone, and especially to those who would treat you in a manner that would not be a godly manner. In the life and story of Joseph, we see the value of character. We see one that is centered on faith and trust in God, one that is devoted to serving God and man with both honor and dependability. His character was unwilling to be deterred by the hatred, by the betrayal, by the forgetfulness of others. We see one that is willing to forgive the wrongs committed by others, despite who they might be. And we see one who is able to see the big picture, that God's wonderful workings and the affairs of men come to good. This noble character can be useful in all seasons of life, just as we've seen with Joseph's life. As a youth who was tempted and tried, potentially feeling abandoned by family and our friends. As a mature individual, one who was charged with innumerable responsibilities, and even to one who was maybe advanced in years, knowing that death may be imminent. That character was exemplified throughout the entirety of his life. So I charge you this evening, may the character of Joseph serve to inspire us to develop our own character as well. That in some small way, we too can be seen as Paul instructed Timothy to be, an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, and in purity, as we see in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12. Certainly, this is something we see in Joseph. So if you're not a Christian this evening, I would encourage you to think hard about where your life stands at this point in time. You may have a good character, and I would encourage you to maintain that. But a good character without Christ is just that. It's just a good character. You need Christ in your life. You need to believe that he is the Son of God, that he came to this earth and gave that life for you because of sin. Sin that can only be paid with that ultimate price of Christ's life. You have to repent of those sins. You have to be baptized for the remission of them and rise and walk in a newness of life, to live a faithful life just as Joseph lived. We are here this evening to help you in whatever way you can, whatever way we need to. If you are a Christian who has fallen by the wayside. Perhaps your character has some flaws in it. We're here for you as well. We'll pray for you. Whatever capacity we can, we want to seek and serve those who are lost. So if you would, come now as we stand and as we sing.